for the project Closer Than Ever, Michaela basically asked me if I wanted to be involved. And I am not an artist in a traditional sense, but I was writing a lot of poetry at the time. And I thought it would be really interesting to play with the way that poetry is represented. Oftentimes we're just reading it. But I thought it would be interesting to kind of make it into a type of installation with sound and kind of force people to have to interact with this voice. So I basically put a poem into a text-to-speech app, and I liked what it did in the sense that I could play with the voice and its pauses in order to create something that felt more layered and also played with a sense of intimacy or a lack of intimacy, because it was kind of being mediated through a computer. I do think of my work with the voice-to-text reader to be a relationship, because it felt like a figure of its own, and because the voice is a real person's voice that's been kind of automated, I could control the words that she was saying, but I couldn't fully control the way that she was saying them. And it did feel like a person, especially because the app had named her Emma. And that kind of added to the experience of it feeling like it coming from a different person. And that was partly helpful for me because it gave me distance to be able to say things that were maybe uncomfortable that I didn't have to say with my own voice. And it meant that I didn't have to record my own voice and play that to people, which I felt was overly intimate in some ways. And I think that was important and kind of relevant now because ultimately the poem, Eschatology is about kind of the end of the world and apocalypse. And I wrote it in a moment where it felt like things were getting worse and they weren't getting better. And people were really interested in the idea of apocalypse and the world ending with like TV shows like The Walking Dead or whatever, things that were talking about like world ending and just like this feeling of like pessimism. And obviously that kind of comes up in the present day. And I didn't want to be the pessimistic person. So it was kind of allowing me to put those pessimistic feelings into another person. And I also wouldn't say that the poem is wholly pessimistic, because part of what is kind of the thing about eschatology, or like thinking about the end of the world, is that worlds end in order to create new worlds. And so I was also thinking about that, like, okay, maybe things are supposed to end in this way because it allows possibility for something new, which I also think is really relevant. It's just kind of a fear of saying that from my own voice. I felt like my voice was loaded, and so in that sense, it was a relationship in the sense that it was a supportive relationship in which she enabled me to be able to say what I wanted to say, ultimately.
Eschatology, or the cult of sleep. If I could just lie down and delineated, loosely, as beginning with mere panegyrics to excess. The lurid floridity. Lurid. Florid. Tasted on the tip of my tongue. Close my eyes and millenarianism, also millenarism. Millenarius. Millennialism. Mill. The 1,000 or 1,000 years of golden ages of paradise. 1,000 years of sleep then. Sosciant makes the creatures again pure, and the resurrection and future existence occur. New heavens. New earth. Everything would be fine.
In a greater sense, the actual work itself relied on the internet, but in the end, its display was super lo-fi. And I mean, it was literally just my cell phone duct taped to a megaphone. And I think that I did that because I wanted to add kind of warmth to the voice in some ways, which the megaphone's kind of crackliness did. I wanted to make it louder, obviously, so that it was just, it was right at the entrance, so it was kind of blaring out at people as they came in. And it was really interesting to see people like engaging with each other and like having kind of the normal like art opening experience of like drinking wine and chatting. And then at the same sense, like I kind of think about it as like those doomsday preachers, like on the train or like on the street or whatever, who are like, the end of the world is nigh. Like it was kind of that situation. Like it's like in the middle of a party and there's just this voice talking about like what the end of the world means. I've been really influenced by reading. I don't think I was reading it at the time, but a book called Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. And a lot of it is about like how technology's role is going to happen as the world shifts and as we kind of get to this like doomsday experience. And I mean, this book was written in the 90s, and all the ways that like its predictions came true are like eerie. Like he predicted like video calls and how like prominent video calls would be. He predicted things like filters, like Snapchat and Instagram filters, like things that I don't think a lot of people were thinking about in that moment. But then I was also really interested in religious text. And I mean, those last two lines are basically drawn from Zoroastrianism, which is kind of a faith in, I guess, the Middle East. Their kind of theology was so different to anything I'd read before. And it did speak about the world existing in like multiple ages, so like a first age, a second age, and then this like third age that hadn't come yet, but that they were hoping for, where the world would end and then something beautiful and perfect would take its place. And so that was like my last kind of ditch effort at like a sense of kind of like hope, I guess, and renewal.
New heavens, new earth. Everything would be fine.
Yeah, it's also that complacency that partly technology imposes on us. And I guess that I drew that a bit from Infinite Jest, in the sense that like there's this belief that like there's going to be the entertainment that's going to like suck up our lives, and we're not going to be able to take ourselves out of that moment, and it will kill us ultimately. And I was thinking about that complacency, especially in relation to technology. I mean, like the infinite scroll that you do on the internet and like on Instagram, you know, and just how like numbing it is, and how it allows us to feel like we're being active when we're not. And then also, like more personally, I was just going through insomnia at the time, and so there's like those interweaving lines, like in between each stanza, and those lines are just about my feelings about insomnia at the time, and how tired I felt, and how much I went to sleep, and how much I couldn't, and how much I was weirdly anxious about sleeping, which happens if you've experienced insomnia. Yeah, so it was a mix of like personal and just also just my thoughts about the world at the time. It was kind of intertextual in the sense I was stealing from other places, and reusing those words for my own purposes. I mean, I think this also is part of the curse of the fact that I work in the art world and not as an artist, but I have a hard time thinking of myself as being an artist and not a writer, which I am ultimately. And I don't think that I think in the visual way that you need to, not quite to the extent that I see artists do. Like I think visually, but not in the same way. And it's more about writing for me. Yeah, I mean, in the second show that we did together at Sites, I think that I'm saying we in the sense of you and me, Michaela, and also we in the sense of me and the boys. But in that second exhibition, it was again me saying things that I might not have felt comfortable saying in my own actual voice, in the sense that I was being really critical of the institution that I was showing the art in, and that felt kind of scary in its own way anyway. So basically, and also the whole art world, it was basically a poem that allowed me to say, like, you've got problems and you're kind of being kind of, it was an abusive relationship in multiple ways for a lot of people.
You don't speak for us all. You're not the reason we came. I feel lighter now I've said it to your face. I'm not sure you're here in good faith. And I've come to complain.
I think that the whole kind of idea mentally for me is that when we hear a computer's voice, we assume that that voice is neutral. And obviously it's not in multiple ways. And I think that I'm also playing with the fact that it isn't neutral. And I think that happened when I did that exhibition Satellites. I worked with the voice again. And in that situation, I was speaking from the sense of like being a satellite or being a computer. and what those feelings and emotions might feel like. I felt like me adding those words was adding a lack of neutrality to the computer in that sense. And it was also really interesting to me how creepy it became once a computer had an emotive voice and was speaking from its own perspective.
And now? You don't care, but I waited in cold, bright, quiet, pinging back and forth with the force of the rays. I have gotten rusty from uninterrupted rotations.
I put that work in like the bathroom because I felt like it needed to be somewhere that was close off and intimate, so like the person that was hearing it on their own. And I haven't been writing much poetry right now, but I'm in the middle of my master's thesis, and I mean, it's these things keep bothering me in terms of like technology and the way that we look at art and the way that we experience each other. And I think that that's kind of something that continues to follow me no matter what I'm doing, whether it's like curating or academia or any of those things. Like, I'm not talking directly about computers, but I'm talking about the ways that they've kind of shifted the world that we live in. I mean, my thesis now is about immaterial labor, but ultimately it's also about the way that artists use the internet in order to speak to people and what that means, because I think that art also has historically such niche audiences. And so why aren't we able to speak to a mass audience when we're speaking on a mass space like Instagram or the internet? So in that sense, yeah, in an indirect sense, I am returning to those same interests. Would I use the voice again, and would I write in that way again? Yes. I think I took a lot out of it, and I think that I'm still interested in playing with its tone, in the sense of like the sounds that the vibrations of the voice make. So using it as more of like an instrument than as just a reader. I mean, yeah, life is long. We're stuck in our homes for a long time. So there's plenty of time for me to experiment in that way. And I miss writing poetry. So it would also just be an excuse to write more poetry and to use my brain in that direction rather than just thinking about other people's art all the time. To me, connecting, and this is why I'm not, even though the internet's not a neutral space, I'm not against it in any kind of way. But to me, connecting means empathizing ultimately and understanding somebody else's worldview and where they're coming from, and kind of having a moment where you fully inhabit their brain in a sense. And I think that you can do that anywhere. You can do that in person. You can do that through a voice call or a video call or a comment. I mean, I'm one of those annoying people that like always responds to people's Instagram like stories and like on forums and things like that, because I think that we are connecting in all of those ways, and sometimes it's not healthy connection, but I think it's still important to ultimately to kind of try and understand that the way other people's brains work. Even what I would consider to be bad art kind of functions to create some kind of connection, as long as somebody feels like they understand where it's coming from and that they resonate with it. And then in a more personal sense, I mean, I think it's partly the foundation of most of my relationships and my friendships right now. And it's kind of the center of my world in a sense. So yeah, I would say that it creates connections. I think that we're lucky to exist in such a social industry, and also for it all to be at the center of these objects that are intended to create kind of social connection. So yeah, definitely, I would say that all art is a form of connection.